Hello, my name is Rob Williamson. This is my final for my oral communications class. I'm giving this speech in front of my parents. Say hello.
Hello.
Awesome. Today we're going to be talking about the X-Men and civil rights through a fictional lens. Comic books are frequently seen as childish. Nowhere is this more evident than in Bill Maher's reaction to the mourning of the passing of Stan Lee in 2018. In response, he said that in his day, comics were for kids. But 20 years or so ago, adults decided to pretend comic books were actually sophisticated literature and suggested that only in a country where this was true could Donald Trump ever be elected president. However, the graphic novel Watchmen appears on Time's 100 Best Novels list. And comic books can be used to analyze cultural events and show deeper themes about humanity. And today we are going to use the X-Men to show this. We're going to use the X-Men to show that they were created as an analogy for civil rights struggles, that they paralleled the civil rights leaders and ideologies of the time, and that they could even be used to examine real-world events like the HIV/AIDS crisis. And of course, we start at the beginning. The X-Men were created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in 1963 and first appeared in X-Men #1 in September of that year. This was a team of American teenagers learning to use their powers. Mentored by Professor Charles Xavier, they were being taught to use their powers to protect humanity. Xavier hoped for peaceful coexistence with society around them. Of course, as any good comic book character does, they dealt with struggles. They were opposed by Magneto and his Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who was a direct opposite of Xavier. Magneto believed in mutant superiority, and because of this thought that peaceful coexistence was impossible. But more than that, the X-Men had to deal with humanity, which hated and feared them just because of who they were. Unfortunately, in 1969, sales of the X-Men comics lagged, and in December of 1970, they began to reprint old stories in new issues so as to continue having the comics coming out, but without having to create anything new. This changed in 1975 with the introduction of an all-new, all-different X-Men. The new team was created by Len Wein and Dave Cockrum. The team highlighted a diverse group of adults from all around the world, including Storm from Kenya, Colossus from the Soviet Union, Wolverine from Canada, and even Nightcrawler from Germany, who did not even look human. As opposed to stories about learning to use their powers, this new team was already experienced with what they could do. So the stories were instead about their life as mutants, dealing with the society around them that did not trust or even feared them. After Giant Size X-Men #1, the series was taken over by Chris Claremont, and he was later joined by artist John Byrne. Together, these two created the most famous era of the X-Men comics, including some of the critically acclaimed and influential stories such as The Death of Thunderbird, where the death of the main character was unthinkable at the time, Days of Future Past, which was recently adapted into a movie, and possibly their most famous story, The Dark Phoenix Saga, which has been adapted in 2 movies and 3 different cartoon shows. These were stories about death, loss, and sacrifice, with varied characters all having to deal with each other, and set the dynamic for X-Men comics even to the modern day as an ensemble book with every character given equal weight. And with that, we start on the main theme of X-Men, bigotry and racism. Stan Lee was a large proponent of civil rights even from early on. With Jack Kirby, he created the first Black superhero in comics, the Black Panther, and 2 years later wrote in his own personal column, Stan's Soapbox, that sooner or later we must learn to judge each other on our own merits. Sooner or later, if man is ever to be worthy of his destiny, We must fill our hearts with tolerance. Ironically, mutants were created because Stan was feeling a little bit lazy. He and Jack Kirby have been the most prolific comic book team possibly in existence, creating famous characters such as Iron Man, Thor, Black Panther, the Incredible Hulk, one of their most famous creations, Spider-Man. And as a result, Stan Lee did not want to have to come up with another origin, so he said, what if they're just born that way? But in doing so, he created one of the best analogies in comics for racism. The X-Men were not hated because of anything they had done. They were hated simply because they were born different. Jack Kirby, who designed the look of the original X-Men, said that he made them look human on purpose. He did not want to create a group of aliens or outsiders to humanity. He wanted to create a team inside the human race. He said, I made the X-Men part of the human race, which they were. The X-Men were also used to confront dark parts of human history, including the revelation that Magneto was a survivor of the Holocaust and had seen his families die in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. This caused his view that humans and mutants could not coexist, believing that humanity would treat mutants the same way they had the Jews in the Holocaust. And he fought against this idea, including during the introduction in a 1984 storyline of the Mutant Registration Act, where mutants were expected to register simply because of how they were born. The X-Men comics were used to analyze the different viewpoints of civil rights during the early days. In his article on the inspiration Stan Lee received, Dante Ciampaglia drew parallels between the views of Xavier, hoping for a peaceful coexistence, with the views of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., whereas Magneto paralleled the views of Malcolm X, believing that coexistence peacefully was never possible and that violence was inevitable. Both wanted to protect mutants, but they disagreed on how to accomplish their goals. Later, the X-Men comics were shown that they could parallel the struggles of the LGBTQ community. In a scene in the movie X2, Bobby Drake reveals to his parents that he is a member of the X-Men, and his mother asks him that question that gay people all over the world are familiar with. Have you tried not being a mutant? This was most clear in the introduction of the Legacy virus in 1993. It was a virus that unraveled the DNA of its victims and mostly afflicted the mutant community. It was a clear parallel to the HIV/AIDS crisis and hysteria of the time. In his article, Jackson Ayers described both, in comparison, as impersonal forces that threatened a minority and was met with indifference from the majority. The X-Men comics were used to examine the reaction of society to the AIDS epidemic. Now, these are just a few examples, but they do show that comics can portray deep stories and provide analysis of bitter struggles and dark events in our own history. And they can teach us how we can act better. In the History Channel documentary, Superheroes Decoded, one of their guests sum up Stan Lee's hopes for the X-Men comics. Everyone thinks they're getting a thing about lasers out of your eyes, but what you're really getting is a lesson in tolerance, and that's the best superhero of all. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Have a nice day.